was your family's most creative punishment? My father believed that women who misbehaved needed to lose a tooth for every offense. By the time I turned 18, my mother was missing half her mouth and my older sister could barely chew solid food anymore. Dad kept the pliers in a special wooden box on the mantle like they were something to be proud of. He'd inherited them from his father, who'd inherited them from his father before that. 4 generations of keeping our women in line, he'd say, while polishing the metal until it gleamed. My brothers would nod along like this was completely normal, while us girls stayed silent because speaking up counted as misbehavior. The rules for what counted as misbehavior changed depending on Dad's mood. Burning dinner was always 1 tooth. Talking back was 2 teeth. Looking at him wrong when he was drunk could be 3 teeth depending on how drunk he was. Mom had lost her first tooth on their wedding night for crying too loudly. She'd lost 6 more over the years for various infractions like asking for grocery money or suggesting they visit her parents for Christmas. My sister Claire lost her first tooth at 13 for wearing lipstick she'd gotten from a friend at school. Dad had spotted the faint pink residue even after she'd tried to wipe it off in the bathroom. He'd called all of us into the living room for the ceremony like he always did. My brothers held her arms while Dad got his pliers, and Mom just stood there with tears rolling down her face, because crying silently wasn't considered misbehavior, but trying to intervene was worth at least 2 teeth. I learned to be invisible after watching what happened to Claire. Never spoke unless spoken to directly. Never made eye contact. Never did anything that could be interpreted as defiance. But perfection was impossible in our house because Dad would find reasons to punish us, even when we'd done nothing wrong. He'd claim we'd given him a look, or had an attitude in our voice that only he could detect. Mom tried to protect us in small ways without directly defying him. She'd warn us when he was in a particularly bad mood so we could hide in our rooms. She'd take blame for things we'd done, hoping he'd be satisfied with punishing just her. By the time I was 16, she was missing 12 teeth and could barely eat anything harder than soup. She covered her mouth when she talked and never smiled anymore. My sister Claire lost 4 more teeth over the next few years. 1 for coming home 5 minutes past curfew. 1 for getting a B on her report card instead of straight A's. 2 for refusing to quit her after-school job when Dad decided she was getting too independent. She started developing a lisp from the gaps in her mouth, and kids at school called her a hockey player because of all the missing teeth. The ritual was always the same. Dad would announce the infraction at dinner, then make us all gather in the living room. The guilty party would sit in the special chair they'd inherited along with the pliers. My brothers would hold her shoulders. Dad would make a speech about maintaining order and respecting authority while heating the pliers over a candle flame to sterilize them. Then he'd reach into her mouth while she tried not to scream because screaming was another tooth. I made it to 17 without losing any teeth, which Dad said was suspicious. "No woman is that well behaved," he'd mutter while staring at me during dinner. "You're hiding something." He started inventing infractions just to have an excuse. I'd apparently looked at him disrespectfully even though I hadn't looked at him at all. I'd walked too loudly on the stairs. My breathing was aggressive. He was building up to something and everyone knew it. Things changed when our cousin visited from the city and saw Mom's destroyed mouth. She pretended everything was normal during dinner, but I saw her taking pictures when she thought no one was looking. 2 days after she left, we had cops at our door. Someone had reported suspected abuse. Dad was calm as he explained that the women in our family had genetic dental problems, and he showed them forged medical records he'd been preparing for years just in case. After the cops left, Dad called a family meeting. "Someone in this house contacted outsiders," he said while looking directly at me. "That's the ultimate misbehavior." I protested that I hadn't done anything, but he'd already decided I was guilty. 10 teeth, he announced. All at once, tonight. Mom actually gasped out loud, which earned her 2 more teeth for the outburst. That night, they prepared everything while I sat in my room trying not to throw up from fear. 10 teeth would destroy my mouth. I'd look like a monster. I'd never be able to eat normally again. Mom snuck into my room after midnight when Dad was drinking with my brothers. "Run," she whispered through her ruined mouth. "Take Claire and run now while they're distracted." But Claire was too broken to run. She just sat in her room staring at nothing like she always did. I could hear Dad calling my name from downstairs. My brothers were coming up to get me. Mom was crying and begging them to wait until morning, but Dad said justice couldn't wait. They dragged me down to the living room where the chair was waiting. Dad had the pliers ready, and my brothers took their positions. "Open wide," Dad said with a smile that showed all his perfect teeth. "This is what happens when women forget their place in this family." Mom screams like something broke inside her and throws herself sideways into the bookshelf. Books and picture frames crash to the floor in a mess of glass and paper. Dad and my brothers all turn toward the noise at the same time. "I don't think... Just move." I throw my body sideways out of the chair and my shoulder hits the floor hard. I'm crawling before I even register the pain, scrambling across the carpet toward the hallway on my hands and knees. My brother Mark lunges for my ankle, but his fingers just brush my pajama pants. I'm already pulling myself up using the doorframe, already running. I take the stairs 3 at a time and my bare feet barely touch the steps. Dad roars something behind me, but I can't make out the words over the sound of my own breathing. I hit the back door at full speed and don't even try to turn the handle properly. Just slam my whole body against it until it flies open. The cold night air hits my face and arms like a slap. I'm running across our yard in just my pajamas and bare feet. The grass is wet and cold under my feet. I can hear Dad's voice getting closer behind me. I don't look back, just run harder toward the road. My lungs start burning after the first block. The gravel road cuts into my feet and I can feel something warm running between my toes that's probably blood. I keep running anyway because stopping means going back to that chair. I make it 2 streets over before my legs start shaking so bad I have to stop. There's a truck parked along the curb and I duck behind it, pressing my back against the cold metal. My hands shake so badly I almost drop my phone when I pull it from my pajama pocket. I dial 911 and try to whisper, but my voice comes out shaky and too loud. The dispatcher answers and I tell her my address and that I need help right now. She tells me to stay on the line and asks where I am exactly. I describe the truck and the street name that I can barely read in the dark. She says police are 3 minutes away and to stay hidden. She keeps talking to me in this calm voice, asking my name and if I'm hurt. I tell her my feet are bleeding, but that's not the important part. I can hear Dad's truck engine somewhere close, driving slow like he's searching. The sound gets louder and then quieter and then louder again as he circles the blocks. I press myself smaller against the truck's wheel well, trying to disappear. The dispatcher keeps asking me questions about what happened, and I answer in whispers, telling her about the pliers and the chair and how I ran. She doesn't sound shocked or like she thinks I'm lying. She just keeps talking in that steady voice and telling me help is almost there. 2 patrol cars turn onto the street with their lights off. I can see them rolling slow toward where I'm hiding. The female officer gets out first and finds me still crouched behind the truck. I'm shivering so hard my teeth are chattering even though it's not that cold. She wraps her jacket around my shoulders while her partner talks into his radio. They position both patrol cars between me and the direction of my house, blocking the view. The female officer asks if I can walk and I nod even though my feet hurt really bad. They help me into the back of one car and the partner calls for an ambulance. The emergency room is bright and too warm after being outside. A doctor named Autumn Wise comes in and starts examining my feet under the lights. She takes pictures of the cuts from the gravel, and then notices the old scars on my arms. She asks gentle questions about where those came from while she cleans the gravel out of my cuts with tweezers. I tell her about the ceremonies and how my brothers would hold our arms during the tooth extractions. She doesn't interrupt or act like she doesn't believe me. She just keeps cleaning my feet and taking more pictures of the scars. I find myself telling her everything because she actually listens. I tell her about Mom's missing teeth and Claire's lisp and the wooden box on the mantle. I tell her about the 4 generations and the forged medical records, and how Dad was going to take 10 teeth tonight. She finishes bandaging my feet and then sits down on the stool next to the bed. She says she's going to call someone who can help, and that I did the right thing by running. A detective shows up around 2 in the morning when I'm still in the emergency room. His name is Jason Manning, and he sits in the chair beside my bed with a notebook. He asks me to start from the beginning and explain everything. I tell him about the pliers and the chair and how it's been happening for generations. He doesn't act shocked or like this is too crazy to be real. He just writes everything down and asks specific questions about dates and how many times it happened. He treats my story like it matters instead of like I'm some kid making things up. When I finish talking, he asks about Mom and Claire. He wants to know if they're still at the house. I tell him yes and start crying because I left them there with Dad. Manning says he can send officers to check on them if I want. I'm scared that a welfare check will make everything worse. Dad will know I talked and he'll punish them. But Manning says they'll be careful and just ask to see that everyone is okay. They won't mention me or say why they're really there. I agree because I need to know if Mom and Claire are safe. Manning steps out to make the call and I sit in the hospital bed staring at my bandaged feet. The officers come back about an hour later. Manning returns to my room and sits down again. He says Dad refused to let them inside the house. Dad showed them those fake medical records again and said everyone was asleep and fine. The officers couldn't force their way in without a warrant. Manning's jaw gets tight when he tells me this. He says we need more evidence to get a warrant, but right now the priority is keeping me safe. I ask what happens next and he explains about protective orders and investigations. A victim advocate arrives right when the sun is coming up. His name is Tanner Owens and he's carrying a bag with clothes and toiletries. He sits down and explains that I'll be going to an emergency shelter. The location is confidential so Dad can't find me there. He breaks down what happens next with protective orders and investigations, making it sound less scary by going through each step. He tells me I'll meet with a judge and probably have to tell my story again. He says it's normal to feel scared, and that he'll be there to help me through each part. The clothes he brought are basic things like jeans and a t-shirt and a toothbrush. Everything feels surreal, like this is happening to someone else and I'm just watching. Tanner drives me to the shelter while the sky is still dark and the streets are empty. The building looks normal from outside, just a regular house in a quiet neighborhood, which I guess is the point so nobody knows it's there. A staff member meets us at the door and leads me upstairs to a small room with a bed, a desk, and a window with bars on it. She shows me how the lock works and hands me the only key. I stand there holding this tiny piece of metal and something breaks inside me, because I've never had a door I could lock before. At home my door didn't even have a lock and Dad would come in whenever he wanted. Now I have this key and nobody can get to me and I sit on the floor and cry. So hard I can't breathe. The staff member sits with me until I calm down, and then shows me where the bathroom is and tells me breakfast is at 7. I lock the door after she leaves and test it 3 times to make sure it really works. The room is basic but clean and there's a stack of donated clothes in the closet that mostly fit. I try to sleep but every sound makes me jump because part of me thinks Dad will find me somehow. Morning comes and I go downstairs for breakfast, where there are 4 other women and 2 kids, but nobody asks questions. After breakfast, the staff member whose name is Rita gives me a huge stack of paperwork to fill out. Medical history, insurance information, emergency contacts, safety planning documents. My hand cramps from writing and some of the questions make me cry again, like the one asking if I feel safe. A nurse comes by to check my feet and change the bandages and take photos of the cuts for documentation. Then I meet with a crisis counselor who has an office in the basement. She tells me her name is Dr. Yoon, and that I don't have to talk about anything I'm not ready to discuss. We sit in silence for most of the session, which feels weird but also kind of okay. She gives me her card and says I can come find her anytime, day or night, if I need to talk. Back in my room, I try calling Claire 3 times, but she doesn't answer. Each time it goes to voicemail, I feel sicker because I don't know if she's okay, or if Dad is punishing her for me running. I text her asking if she's safe, but the message just says delivered, not read. My stomach hurts so bad I can barely eat lunch. Manning calls around 6 that evening and asks how I'm doing at the shelter. I tell him about trying to reach Claire and he says he'll look into it. Then he tells me he contacted Veronica to ask about the photos she took when she visited. I feel guilty dragging her into this, but Manning says she's the one who reported the abuse in the first place, so she's already involved. He asks if I'm okay with him using those photos as evidence, and I say yes because we need proof. Veronica calls Manning back within an hour and says she's sending everything she has. Manning calls me again to say the photos are coming through and there are dozens of them. Veronica took pictures of Mom's mouth from every angle during her visit 2 weeks ago, and they all have timestamps. She also sends screenshots of text messages where Mom tried to explain away the missing teeth as genetic problems, but the messages don't match what's actually visible in the photos. Manning sounds excited in a professional way, and says this evidence really helps the case. I feel relieved that someone documented what Dad did, but also scared about what happens next. On day 3, Manning picks me up from the shelter to take me to the courthouse for an emergency protective order hearing. I have to sit in front of a judge and describe the abuse while Dad's lawyer and a court reporter write everything down. My voice shakes so bad I have to repeat myself twice, and at one point I start crying and the judge gives me a break to get water. Manning sits next to me the whole time, and when I finish testifying, the judge grants a temporary order. Dad and my brothers aren't allowed within 500 feet of me or to contact me in any way. The judge says the order is good for 2 weeks, and then we'll have another hearing to make it permanent. I should feel safer, but instead I feel more scared because now Dad knows for sure that I talked. Back at the shelter, Rita helps me set up online classes so I don't fall behind in the school. She gives me a laptop and shows me how to log into the virtual classroom. Having homework feels almost normal, and I spend the afternoon working on algebra problems, which is easier than thinking about everything else. My English teacher sends an email saying she noticed I've been absent and asking if everything is okay. I don't know how to respond, so I just tell her I'm safe now and working on catching up. Her response says she's glad I'm safe and that she's here if I need anything. It makes me realize she probably saw signs that something was wrong but didn't know how to help. Manning comes back on day 5 with news about interviewing neighbors. He talked to the family next door and the couple across the street. Both of them admitted they heard screaming from our house over the years during what they called family discipline. They said they never called anyone because Dad's family has lived here for generations, and people don't interfere in family business. Manning looks frustrated when he tells me this and says that attitude is exactly why abuse continues. But their statements help build the case even if they should have done something sooner. Between day 5 and day 8, I try calling Claire every day, but she never answers. Then finally I get a text from her that just says I'm scared. I try calling immediately, but Dad answers her phone. He doesn't say anything, just breathes into the phone for a few seconds, and then hangs up. My hands are shaking when I call Manning to tell him what happened. He says this gives him cause to request another welfare check with more authority, and possibly get Child Protective Services involved. He tells me not to try calling Claire again because it might make things worse. On day 8, Veronica drives 3 hours from the city to visit me at the shelter. She brings her parents, who are my Aunt Haley and Uncle Gerard. I haven't seen them in years because Dad didn't like us having contact with Mom's side of the family. They hug me carefully like I might break, and Aunt Haley cries while holding my face in her hands. Uncle Gerard keeps saying he's sorry they didn't know and didn't help sooner. Veronica tells me I can come stay with them in the city if I want, and that their door is always open. The offer makes me cry because I didn't know I had anywhere else to go. Manning shows up at the shelter that same afternoon to interview Veronica in person about what she observed during her visit. They sit in the common room while I wait upstairs, and afterward Manning comes to tell me what she said. Veronica described how Mom covered her mouth constantly when she talked and barely ate any solid food at dinner. She said she suspected something was wrong, but didn't realize how bad it was until she saw Mom's teeth up close. She's been feeling guilty for not acting sooner, even though Manning tells her she did the right thing by documenting everything and reporting it. Veronica took those photos because she knew nobody would believe the truth without proof, and now that proof might be what saves Mom and Claire. The next morning, Manning calls to say the prosecutor wants to meet with me. Her name is Sinead Hunter, and she arrives at the shelter 2 hours later carrying a thick file folder and a laptop bag. We sit in the same conference room where I gave my first statement, and she spreads photos across the table between us. Photos of Mom's mouth, photos of Claire's mouth, photos of the pliers and the chair that Manning took when he responded to my 911 call. Hunter explains they're building a case for aggravated assault and child abuse charges against Dad. She doesn't sugarcoat anything. The forged medical records make it harder because Dad's been planning his defense for years. But Veronica's photos and the neighbor statements are starting to create a pattern of evidence that contradicts his genetic disease story. She asks if I'm willing to testify in court if it comes to that. I tell her yes, even though